architecture of secrecy. But what came afterwards, and we're still living with today, we're talking about compartmentalization, which was the bedrock way that he organized things. You only needed to know what you needed to know and nothing else. So that kept everyone limited to a certain spot. And I characterize it as a kind of pyramid, that down at the bottom, people hardly knew what they were working on at all. Maybe they were just turning a dial or something at Oak Ridge. And as you went up the pyramid, fewer and fewer people knew more and more about the different aspects of the program. And at the very top was General Groves, who knew everything. And it was really basically the source of his power, because he was able to orient things in such a fashion to keep it moving. So I could talk about all of that, and I could talk about Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall and David Greenglass, who are three spies that we know something about. But what I'd really like to do today is take a little bit of time and tell you about someone maybe you haven't heard of, and that's George Koval. And we have someone with us here who knew Koval, so we'll hear from him later. But I'd just like to introduce Koval to you. There will be an article about him in a journal, I hope, in the fall, in September, with a co-author of mine, Mark Kramer, at the Journal of Cold War Studies. That's where this would be published. And my half of it is sort of the American story of George Koval, and Mark's part of it is sort of the Russian part of it. So how do we know about Koval? Well, on October 22nd, 2007, of all people, Russian President Vladimir Putin posthumously bestowed the hero of the Russian Federation gold medal on George Koval, who was dead at that time. And he said, for the courage and heroism displayed in carrying out a special mission. And on November 2nd, in a ceremony, Russian President Putin handed Koval's medal and documents to the defense minister in the GRU museum. The GRU is Army Intelligence, Red Army Intelligence. Not the KGB, but the military side of things. So this is how we know about George Koval. He was outed by, of all people, Vladimir Putin. A miracle. So who was Koval? He was an American citizen, and he spied for the Soviet Union for almost 10 years, from 1939 to 1948, with most of his time spent in Oak Ridge, almost a year, 11 months, followed up by 6 months at Dayton, Ohio. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, how did he get here? His parents were Russian Jews, and they came to America, like many immigrants did, from Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, and they located themselves in Sioux City, Iowa. And George was born there in 1918, along with an older brother. And as I said, they were Russian Jews and believed Stalin. This is one of the amazing facts. Stalin decided to establish a kind of socialist Jewish homeland, a kind of Palestine, kind of place for Jews. And he did so at a place called Bederson, out at the edge of nowhere in Siberia. And believe it or not, thousands of people went from all over the world to occupy this place. And among them was the Koval family from Sioux City, Iowa. So they took George with them and his brother, and off they go to Bederson. still exists. It was a failure as an experiment for a Jewish homeland. The winters were long and cold. The summers were hot. The soil was bad. People were naive. It was a disaster. But nevertheless, George spent 2 years there learning Russian. He was an American citizen. And he goes to Moscow to the Mendeleev Institute and gets more education. He had already graduated from high school in Sioux City. He had already been a year at the University of Iowa. So he's on the ball here. He has quite a bit of knowledge. And somehow he comes to the attention of the GRU at this point. Perfect mole. We'll send him back to America and see what happens. So they send him back. He arrives back in the United States on the West Coast in 1940, comes all the way to New York City. And at that point, it's the run-up for World War II, and FDR and others are getting ready for it, and there's a Selective Service Act, and he's drafted into the U.S. Army. Now, another program they had in the U.S. Army was the Army Specialized Training Program, ASTP, in which they would take out smarter Army GIs, send them to college for further education, and make better use of them than just sending them to the front. George became a part of the ASTP and was sent to City College in Upper Manhattan. So, and then in the most fortuitous situation, which no one could have predicted, and it was just a lucky hit for the Soviets, George is selected for the Special Engineer Detachment. Now, we heard quite a bit about the SEDs, that they were the junior members that assisted the senior scientists. They were graduate students. They were a special group, and they were very important. George gets tapped for that and gets sent to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where he becomes a health physicist. And he basically has the run of the place, and he's using instruments that were designed, we heard earlier, the person who designed them, measuring the radiation, is everyone safe? So George is probably ingesting an enormous amount of information about how uranium is enriched, K-25 plant, the Y-12 plant, and plutonium, and basically has the run of the place. Now, I've heard he had his own Jeep.
He was more involved with the reactors than he was with the K-25.
Right. But living in the SED barracks, living in the barracks among his colleagues, he must have learned a great deal. And he's passing this information on to Russia. Now, we don't know how he did that or who his contact was. I'm hoping that Mark Kramer, my co-author, is digging into the Russian archives and is finding out more about how this information was transmitted. But just the fact that 75,000 people are living in Oak Ridge, I mean, this must get the attention of the Russians. Something's going on here. What's going on? And so unfortunately, we don't know the kinds of information that he passed on. So he spends 11 months at Oak Ridge, and then he's sent to Dayton, Ohio. And Dayton, Ohio is the place, it's probably the most secret part of Secret Manhattan Project, where polonium was produced and developed and sent to Los Alamos. Now, polonium, along with beryllium, is made into a little marble that goes on the inside of a plutonium core bomb, and it spawns neutrons. And for the Russians to know about that is, a big fact, something they didn't have to discover themselves. The Russians could have done all of this by themselves, but it would have taken longer. It's generally said that the espionage by Fuchs, by Hall, and now by Koval, probably sped up the Soviet program by maybe 18 months. So they got the bomb a year and a half earlier than they would have if they had done it themselves. And what was prevented was going down a lot of dead ends that we went down and found out that didn't work, and these spies conveyed all of that information. So George is at Dayton, Ohio, passing on information about polonium. The war ends. He goes back, he's discharged from the Army and goes back to school in New York City and gets his degree and Army Bill of Rights, and the GI Bill of Rights, probably. And then in 1948, and we don't know why, he's called back to Moscow. And we don't know what triggered that fact of why he was called back, but he was. And he spent the rest of his life back in the Soviet Union and Russia, and died just a little while ago. Now, one of his SED buddies, a person named Arnold Kramish, whose name came up before, was with Koval as an ASTP at CCNY and also in Oak Ridge. And pretty soon, in the early 50s, they look around. The U.S. government looks around. Where's George? He's blown the coop here. He's gone. He got away scot-free. And they come and they interview all of his former colleagues and create a 900-page FBI file, which Arnold Kramish, who was very close to Koval, first asked for under the Freedom of Information Act, and later I got in a week and a half, because it had already been declassified. So most of the information here is from that 900-page FBI file on George Koval, but it doesn't go into the key questions. What did he pass on, and when and how? So there's more of the story to tell, and this just goes to show you that we're not done with the Manhattan Project yet at all here. There are many loose ends here and strands to explore, and espionage is clearly one of them. Finally, why did Vladimir Putin out George Koval and say that he was a spy publicly? I mean, this all could have been done privately, and we never would have known about it. And our government has known about it for more than 50 years and hasn't uttered a peep about it. We had to rely on Putin. So why did he do it? Well, I think two reasons. One, just because he's Vladimir Putin and he loves to stick an eye in America's space. So it's beating his chest and saying, look, this man helped us get the bomb, and you never found out about him, and we're going to honor him today. But more importantly, I think it's the GRU. It's the Army Intelligence. When the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, there was a great competition between the KGB and the scientists. Who developed the bomb? Who should get more credit for the Soviet bomb? Should it be the spies in the KGB, people like Fuchs and Hall, or the scientists? And as a result of that competition, we in the West learned a great deal about the Soviet bomb. I mean, we did it. And they published things. And I think what we have here is Army Intelligence's role in the whole thing. This is not the KGB. This is another unit of Soviet intelligence. And it was Putin giving credit to Army Intelligence for its help in solving the problem. So I think that's all I'll have to say about George Koval today. And we have next to us here someone who knew George and has some things to say about him.
Thank you. I had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of having contact with two spies on the project. One of which was George Koval, who at Oak Ridge was an instrument, a health physicist, as Dr. Norris said, and who was using instruments that I had a part in developing in his work. And so I met him there at the first time. Of course, I didn't know he was a spy until, what was it, last year that Cindy asked me, did I know George Koval? And told me he was a spy. At any rate, so I knew George at Oak Ridge because I trained him on the instruments, as I did when he went to Monsanto, and on some different instruments which I had developed. He's a wonderful guy. I just wanted to say that when I went on the project, when I was going to be transferred to the project, the government took great pains to investigate my background in depth. Immediate and even distant members of my family were contacted by the FBI, and old friends, present friends, and old friends were contacted by the FBI and asked about me and what I had done in my life. And so I don't know how he got through without being found out. To me, it's amazing. At any rate, he did. I knew him. I worked with him mostly at Monsanto Chemical, where he, as Dr. Norris said, he was where they were producing polonium. And my instruments that I had developed were widely used there for measuring the alpha rays from polonium. The instruments that I developed had two parallel plates inside, brass plates, and the polonium that they wanted to measure, for whatever purposes, was deposited on little platinum discs about an inch in diameter, and then they would be inserted into this device on the bottom plate. The plates were about a centimeter apart inside of a tube, a brass tube, and then there was amplifiers and so forth to take it to another instrument that counted the impulses that were the electrical impulses that were developed by the alpha rays going through the air and creating ions as they ionize the air, and then the ions would be collected by voltage on the two plates, and it would be a small electrical pulse, which then would be amplified and counted by an electronic counter. And that's basically what my instrument did. And any rate, so I had to train him on the maintenance and so on of those instruments, and train his people as well, people who worked there. At Monsanto, he may have been health physics at Monsanto, but I was not aware of that. But he was in charge of maintaining these instruments at Monsanto.
Who's the other spy?
Huh?
Who's the other spy?
I'll get to that. One of the things I wanted to mention was that I thought might be of interest. Polonium, for two reasons, had a tendency to spread and contaminate whatever it was near or in. It had a rather high vapor pressure, and in addition, when the alpha rays were expelled, they kicked other polonium off of, to where nearby. And so in order to keep the background radiation, whenever you're measuring radiation, you have to be concerned about background radiation, which includes cosmic rays and whatever radioactivity comes from, natural radioactivity that comes from whatever materials are around. Might be brass, for example, or whatever, has some natural radioactivity. And then the polonium would contaminate these discs that the brass discs that the samples to be measured were put on. So I had to devise a means of cleaning those chambers, and that project involved getting samples of light sandpaper from every manufacturer of sandpaper in the country, and some in Europe for that matter, in order to find a sandpaper with the lowest alpha ray, natural alpha ray contamination. And fortunately I was able to find one that was very low, and that was used to sand and clean these brass plates in between measurement of the platinum discs with the polonium on them. As I said, George Koval was a nice guy. We were good friends because I was there often to upgrade the equipment and so on. And he, we had dinner together, lunch together. I mean, he was. I never suspected him of anything. And that's the story of George Koval. On the other experience I had is that I was at the University of Chicago, the Met Lab. I lived at a graduate fraternity house, and because there was a lot of because all their members were in the Army or Navy, they had empty rooms, and they were very happy to get renters. So I would rent a room in a graduate fraternity house, and of course a number of other project bachelors were also rented at the fraternity house as well, and the fraternity house. Well, we weren't members of the fraternity. Then there were a few members of the fraternity who were there, as well as some naval medical students. They had parties, from time to time, and we were invited to attend the parties. And noticeable at these parties was a very beautiful blonde lady who was dated by many of the scientists. I was not among them because I was too young for her. But many of the scientists, the young in their 20s and 30s, dated her. And she was there for quite a while. And then one day, she was gone. I mean, she didn't show up at any of the parties. And then the word came out that she had been picked up by the FBI.
What was her name, Jim?
What was her name?
I don't remember.
That's a mystery.
Well, that's another one to solve there. That's another one to solve.
Okay, I'm Ben Bederson, in case by now you didn't know that. In that case, I believe, the only person who knew two spies, really two spies.
Yeah.
David Greenglass and Ted Hall. I actually knew a third spy, too, in New York. I'm not going to mention her name. It was a lady, too. You have to remember the SEDs were a mixed group. Many of them were budding scientists, but some were engineers, and some were, a lot, in fact, were machinists. And as you can gather from what you've heard here, machinists played a very important role in the development of the atomic bombs, both, particularly the implosion bomb. The reason being that there's a lot of parts had to be manufactured, and there was no templates. Everything had to be done from absolute scratch. The country was scoured for machinists, and David Greenglass was caught up in this. In fact, he was a pretty good machinist. He wandered around, and he was drafted, got into the Army, wandered around a few places, was finally picked to go to Los Alamos. He ended up in the SED first dormitory. There were two dormitories. In the SED dormitory, in a particular bed. The particular bed was next to mine, exactly next to mine. Above, you have to understand, we were pretty crowded. There were double beds. There were double deckers. Above me was my old friend, William Spindell, who was an SED. And above David Greenglass was David Greenglass was a friend of his, High Adler, a machinist. You have to remember, this was, the David Greenglass and I came from similar backgrounds. In fact, we found out right away that we had very similar backgrounds. David Greenglass grew up on the Lower East Side. He lived on Stanton Street. My first 5 years of my life was on Stanton Street. David Greenglass was a member of the movement, as it was called. He let it be known right away that he was a communist. Maybe this is a surprise. You hear how General Groves is very careful about his security. David Greenglass was an out-and-out communist. Everything that Russia did was good. He defended Russia all the time. He was very political. And now you have to remember, also you have to know that my background was very similar. I came from a radical background. He knew where I grew up in the Bronx, which was a communist neighborhood, in which probably 2/3 of the people were communists. They even had for a while an alderman was elected in the city government who was a communist. So he knew that I had a similar background to his. He also knew that I had actually lived in the Soviet Union for a while. So he was very free in his dealings with me. There was one difference. David Greenglass was a communist and was a communist at the time that he was at Los Alamos. I had long before already lost my communist leanings. I was, as you may know, the Soviet Union was the first a place that was very, very sympathetically viewed upon by New York Jews. Anti-Semitism played a major role in the immigration of Jews to America from Russia. When the revolution occurred in the Soviet Union, Jews were very sympathetic to the revolution because it was felt that the revolution was going to ban anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism was a motivation that caused many New York Jews to be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. This is the historic background, which I think drove Greenglass, who was very Jewish in his cultural behavior. Now, very in the development of the politics of the New York community. Every once in a while, something would happen that would cause a sloughing off of people who believed in the communism. The Soviet Union did a lot of pretty horrible things. Stalin eventually murdered many more people even than Hitler did. He eventually became anti-Semitic. Very few New York Jews remained communists by the 1940s, except for what you might call the true believers. Now, as you know, a true believer really believes, and it's impossible for a true believer to not find a rationalization for explaining almost anything. Greenglass, therefore, kept his political beliefs all the way through up until 1944. I had long ago gotten rid of them, and I became much more interested in physics than I was in politics. Our relation at Los Alamos began to deteriorate as he kept trying to push me, and eventually me and my roommate, my bunkmate, Bill Spindell, asked for a transfer, and we got out of there. We got away from him. That's the beginning of my relationship with Greenglass. It didn't end there, because when Greenglass was caught, he sung like a canary. He did mention to the FBI that he considered contacting several what he would call sympathetic people to act as spies, and he included me among this list. And this is the reason he gave his handler. He said, "Bederson, he's a good fellow. He organized a petition in favor of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president." That was one of his two reasons for thinking that I might become a Soviet agent, because I favored Franklin Roosevelt. That gives you an idea of how smart David Greenglass was. Even though he was a good machinist, but he was not brilliant. The other thing he mentioned was that I lived in this radical neighborhood, and therefore I was probably a good candidate. His handler, Harold Gold, put an end to Greenglass's recruitment efforts, and told him to forget about it. Harold Gold was a lot smarter than David Greenglass. There is a book by Sam Roberts, a writer for the New York Times. It's quite an amazing book. It's called The Brother. It's about David Greenglass and his relation with his sister and his wife, and Julius Rosenberg. Julius Rosenberg was his brother-in-law. Ethel Rosenberg was his sister. Ruth Greenglass was his wife. And when eventually the Venona files came out, and Harold Gold was exposed, and Greenglass was finally smoked out, he gave the FBI everything they wanted to know. He did not hold back. And out of all this developed the tragedy of the Rosenbergs. I call it a tragedy because although what they did was essentially obscene to give away those secrets to the Soviets, you have to understand where they came from. They were the remnants of the true believers that are left over from the entire history of Jews in the Soviet Union and then Jews in Russia. That's why it was a tragedy. The fact that they were executed, it doesn't really relate to what they did. What they did was unforgivable. Having them electrocuted is somehow sad. That out of all of the past history, this should be the culmination. That's all I wanted to say about the Greenglass. I did also know Ted Hall, in a different way. I didn't know Ted Hall politically. A friend of mine, Norman Greenspan, another SED, and I were music lovers. And I think it's safe to say now we built a very fine high fidelity system out of stock from the stock room. It was a beauty, and we played it. We assembled it in the office of another SED, Richard Bellman, who became a famous mathematician. And we played music late at night when nobody was around. We loved Gustav Mahler very much, and therefore we called it a club, the Mushroom Society, because if you know Mahler, he's very gloomy sometimes. Ted Hall heard about the Mushroom Society, and he volunteered to join it. So we admitted him into the Mushroom Society, and Ted Hall showed up late at night, and we would all sit together and moan about Gustav Mahler. That's how I got to know him. I never discussed politics with him. He was a very taciturn guy, and all our conversation only related to music. Incidentally, as a anecdote, an after anecdote of this, in reading The Brother by Sam Robert says that the day that Ted Hall heard about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg being executed, he was listening to Gustav Mahler on the radio. I thought it really shook me up. That's all I wanted to say. I do have a few general words I want to add, which is not really related to this, about the project and why it was so successful. I don't think anybody has yet mentioned the fact that in 1942, during the rise of Hitler and the militarism of Japan, there was a very strong feeling in America that we had to go into the war, but it was not unanimous. On the left and on the right, there was opposition to going into the war. On the right, there was
pacifism to keep American boys out of isolationism, you would call it, keep the boys out of Russia, out of the war. On the left, there was a slogan that said, "The Yanks are not coming." At Pearl Harbor, this all changed. There was a time in America where I think that 99.9% of Americans all believed the same thing. They all wanted to fight the fascists and win the war. It was the only time in recent memory where the America was completely unified. And the fact that the greatest generation, so-called greatest generation of soldiers, I think it was more than that. I think it was the greatest generation of all of America. The Manhattan Project worked successfully
because every single American believed in the war, and they wanted to defeat the Nazis and the fascists, and it was that was what made everybody work together and succeed in building the bomb. By the time 1945 rolled around, people were so eager to end the war that when the atomic bomb went off, there was universal applause. Of course, that changed in later years, but the relief that the bomb produced in the world, in America, was extremely important. Many Americans believe to this day that we saved more lives by the bomb than the bomb itself caused. The bomb was, as has been said before here, the bomb actually saved lives rather than caused, in addition to causing destruction. So that's why, in my opinion, that's why the Manhattan Project was so successful. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes for any questions, if anyone has. Right down here in front, Cindy.
Sorry. I would go a step further than you and say that 1945, before the bomb was dropped, this country had been in a long war. And the choice was either to drop the bomb or to continue that war. And really, we didn't know if the bomb was going to work. But there was never a choice, never a thought of not dropping the bomb.
Well, I think we have to thank President Truman for making a very brave decision and dropping even the second bomb.
Right.
That ended the war within a week of the second bomb being dropped. That
And
we owe him a great.
millions of Japanese lives.
Yes.
Any other questions? Go right over there.
Do you know yet why George Koval, being brought up in America, decided to go along with the GRU and become a spy?
We really don't. There is evidence that in Sioux City, Iowa, he was already sort of radicalized. And it was really ideological. So I guess he was an easy target once he got to the Soviet Union and was approached. And here's an opportunity to go back and be an American citizen, but actually a Soviet mole. This is something that, why does anybody become a spy? And it's ideological, it's money, sometimes. Lately, it's money. The earlier spies have been ideological ones, Kim Philby and Burgess and McLean and true believers like Greenglass and Julius Rosenbergs.
I should point out that all the spies that we know about, all 4 spies now, were ideological spies.
Right.
Not one German spy has ever been revealed. But all 4 spies, just like all other Americans, were patriotic, but they were patriotic for perverse reasons. But they still believed in the war.
I mean, Fuchs was a communist already in Germany before he went to Britain. And this drove Groves nuts because somebody in Britain let him through the loop here and got. Groves kept saying, I want to do a background check on Fuchs. The British mission said, no, that's fine. We already did it. They didn't do it. They never did it. There's a story right there of somebody in, I guess, MI6 had to be give a clearance to Klaus Fuchs, who they already knew was a communist spy. Anyway, that's another one to track down here. I mean, there's so many other parts of this that need to be known. So, but that's ideological to a T. I mean, they didn't take a nickel from like many modern spies, which are of a different character.
Dr.
Yeah. Fuchs. Well, no, Fuchs was an incredible scientist. I mean, a very smart cookie, and contributed to three nations' bombs. I mean, ours, Great Britain, Russia, and some people even say the Chinese. But we have three very documented cases of Fuchs helping the projects of three bomb programs. And no, Fuchs is a very, very competent, smart scientist that was recognized at the time among his colleagues at Los Alamos and certainly afterwards. Really up to Cindy here. Where's Cindy?
Question here.
Dr. Morris, thank you. Thank you to the panel. I want to return back to your introduction of George Koval, and when you said that Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2007 was in a way poking his eye at us, at the Americans, for not being able to detect a nuclear spy. Might I offer a different suggestion that in 2007, Russian-U.S. relations were actually not bad. Presidents Bush and Putin were on a first-name basis. Our country was helping them with their internal strife in Chechnya. And so that when Putin decides to release George Koval's name, it was in fact a bit of an acknowledgement and also possibly an awareness that he knew, we knew about Koval, evidenced by the fact that the FBI had this file on him for decades, that Russian espionage in our country in the Federal Bureau of Investigation had not ceased since the Cold War, and that time had come to sort of, in a sort of twisted sense of cooperation, to say, we know, you know, we know, so why don't we just sort of let it all out into the open? You guys scored some points on us, we've scored some points on you, let's continue moving forward.
Right, okay, well, I accept all of that, and I think that's fine. Putin went on to say, at the museum, when he's handing over George's medals to the GRU, despite the top secret regime at the facilities and strict control over staff, Mr. Koval managed to send descriptions of the sites back to Moscow, along with information on their areas of work and the processes and production volumes of the elements in question. So, I mean, that's about as much as we have about what George actually did. And if I had to rank the reasons why Putin did this, I would put the GRU contribution first, that he was giving credit to Army intelligence. This is from a KGB officer, too. I mean, Putin is he knows the business. And he knows what the KGB did, and here he's acknowledging in the Army intelligence role. But I know relations go up and down with the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and I don't know how that plays into the revelation here. We do know that those archives tightened up, and they're much more difficult to get into. Mark Kramer tells me that, and others who try and do research in Russia. And there was an opportunity when Yeltsin was around, when you could walk in the archives and find out all kinds of important things about Soviet history and Russian history. Cindy?
Again, is there some desperate question? Nobody's desperate. We're going to have another very, very exciting, I thought this was a great session. Thank you very much.